What I thought I would dig into is to say a few words about 2 chapters for the upcoming book that you already mentioned, Janis. And perhaps have a discussion. Even though we don't have too much time, then you can at least get some information about how I and my colleagues are thinking. And if you have feedback for this, please send us an email or drop us a note in some way if you have comments. Okay, so what I would like to talk about today is the one thing that is really central to what we are doing, e-governance. We are doing a literature review on that. And we are also doing another literature review on digital transformation. And in my opinion, these are quite close to the core of what we are doing in our field. So first, e-governance. This is work in progress with my colleague Tove Engvall. She is doing a PhD on governance of environmental information systems using the UN and the EU as cases for her PhD. What we did was to look at e-governance, and we started out with the Digital Government Library, as also several have mentioned before. This has been extensively studied for a number of years, but what we are wondering is how uniformly is this concept used across different studies? I don't know your experience with this. My initial understanding is that we use the same concept, but we use it slightly differently. So we wanted to look into the literature and see how this is being done. When we searched the DGRL and also Google Scholars, we came up with a high number of papers that were relevant. And we've also found a high number of papers focusing explicitly on e-governance and digital governance, but we also found a lot of other related concepts. And I'm sure you've seen many of these. I believe you have some idea of what is meant by them. But what we found is that they are being defined relatively similarly. And then it's up to us to have an opinion on if that's an acceptable position for a scientific field, that we use slightly different concepts, but describe more or less the same meaning to it. I think if we are going to move our field forward, we should really take the discussion and perhaps agree on some core concepts and what they mean. When we started digging into the e-governance studies, we ended up agreeing, Tove and I, that there are basically 2 ways of framing these. One way is by having an interest in ICT and how that relates to governance and government services. And the other main category that we found is concerned with the outcomes of e-governance. And we also found a very good paper by Frank Bannister and Regina Connolly that describes that outcomes can be seen as both structural and normative. So we found those to be meaningful categories at the high level to organize our findings around. We also agreed that there are some what we call superordinate concepts that is really used to make the concept of e-governance. And one is obviously governance, and the other one is whatever that means. So we were curious to see in our sample, how do these scholars, how do we describe and define governance? How do we understand governance? And how do we understand E? Because these are really the basic building blocks on the central concept in our field. So we were curious, how do we understand this? And as you can see, this is work in progress. So I'm not really providing any clear-cut answers here, but hopefully this is something that can be discussed and then an understanding can emerge and we can have progress in the field. There were many of the definitions of e-governance did not relate to the governance literature from political science and public administration at all, but some did. And those who did also often made a distinction between government and governance. I think I have been guilty of not making that distinction very clearly. But if you look at this, these literatures that we sort of borrow these concepts from. They are making a clear distinction between government and governance. However, governance is much about process, it's much about steering, and it can be seen as the state's ability to serve its constituents. And it has a lot to do with decision making. Relationships are important here. And obviously, policy and procedure is at the core of governance. So if I ask my colleagues at the political science department here in Kristiansand about the difference between government and governance, they will say, this is something we also discuss in our field. And you will find a lot of confusing literature on this issue. However, one way of looking at this is that governance is much about process, how to govern, whereas government is much about structure. So what is the entities that we put in place in order for governments to govern? So that's one way of viewing at it or looking at it. I think we can be more sensitive and more explicit about this in our research. So we will try to come up with perhaps some kind of definition based on all these studies. That can be a basis for discussion in the field. The notion of E then, curious to learn your understanding of E. Further, we looked at definitions of e-governance and how they dealt with the notion of E, the technology part of governance, which is one of the two core constructs of that concept. What we found is that much is centered around ICT in various forms. Many are also concerned with networks and the internet or the World Wide Web. Some also say that e-governance would involve advanced forms of ICT. Not so sure about that personally. I think you can have e-governance with relatively simple forms of ICT, but that's something the field could discuss. When we look at the outcomes, the structural outcomes, we found quite a few examples on outcomes that can relate to structure, such as regulation, for instance, policy making, decision making, governance mechanisms, coordination, and so on. So this is something that we will try to massage further and see if we can put it to some meaningful form in a book chapter. I would say most of the studies that we looked at were concerned with normative outcomes, meaning how can e-governance improve governance in various areas, that being efficiency, transparency, accountability. You see the concepts here. So when we look at structure and normative outcomes, there seemed to be an overweight of studies and scholars focusing at the normative outcomes and less on the more structural, which is not that big a surprise if we think that government is perhaps more on structure and governance is more on the outcomes and processes. But hopefully, perhaps our chapter and also more research from more scholars can contribute to clarify this, because currently it seems to be a little bit mixed up in the literature. Some reflection and observations from this work. We found that e-governance and related concepts, as I said, are often used interchangeably, and they are quite often defined very overlapping. So when some people say good governance and others say e-governance, they could very well mean the same, or they could mean something entirely different. And this is a little bit problematic, of course, in a scientific field. There is also when people define e-governance, they do to a varying degree refer to all the knowledge that we could and perhaps should draw on from political science and public administration, all the way down to the Greeks that has been mentioned repeatedly here in the Samos Summit. Also, the notion of E seems very empirically oriented, which may well be fine. We found few, if any, conceptualizations or theorizing around the concept of E. I'm not sure if that's surprising. I think it's certainly something that interests me. So I think at some point the field should be ready to conceptualize and theorize around E in our context, and perhaps also on e-governance. What is that as opposed to governance? Perhaps we could be somewhat more accurate than saying that that's governance with some technology added to it. And finally, we found that there seemed to be in our field a lot of optimism on related to what technology can do. So this is typically in the IS field referred to as technology determinism, where we have the basic assumptions that if we add technology to a problem area, things will be better. And that seemed to be an influential stream of thought in our field. We found very few critical studies, and that is something I think we could benefit from seeing more of. So some possible steps for e-governance research. I would like to see more theorizing related to E, because I think that could help distinguish our field from the parent field of governance and make a more substantial contribution from our field. So that's a call to myself and others to do some more work in this area. I think also we could clarify the role of information systems in e-government theory development, since E is not really, at least not in the sample that we study, has been theorized or conceptualized to any great extent. The information systems field has done work in this area, and we may actually be able to borrow something from that field and use that to develop the governance field. And finally, I think we should really consider having an increased focus on the unintended consequences of e-governance. Is e-governance good all the time in every imaginable instance, or is there also, can we also imagine that it may not be good, however we define good? So I think there is a need for more balanced studies and more critical studies, so that we have a more balanced and better understanding of what e-governance contributes to. I'll move directly over to digital transformation, which is the second chapter that I am working with here in collaboration with Frank, who is here, I think, and also with another colleague, Øystein Sæbø. The reason we wanted to look into this is that digital transformation, in my opinion, is the current buzzword in the information systems research. We have talked about other things before that in information systems research. Now many scholars seem to discuss digital transformation. So what is this then? Is it old wine in new bottles, or is it something new and different? That's what we set out to look at. And then also to discuss the relevance, potential relevance for understanding digital transformation in light of e-governance or digital governance. And this is Frank's excellent table. Let's see if I can. Yeah, good. So we quickly arrived at 4 ways of conceptualizing the digitalization that is happening around us and has been happening for some time. One is digitizing, another is digitization, a third is digitalization, and a fourth is digital transformation. What we found in the IS literature is that sometimes these are used interchangeably, at least some of them, not all of them. And there seems to be some conceptual confusion around these concepts. By the way, this understanding of the concepts here from the IS literature is based on a meta review consisting of a number of existing reviews on digitalization or digital transformation. So what we can distinguish here is quite quickly to see that digitization and digitizing it seems to be something more basic, more simple than the two on the far right side here, which is interesting. We found it much more difficult to distinguish between digitalization and digital transformation, also as you can see here. The half-filled dots here are just an indication of strength in these findings. So can we contribute to to an improved understanding here. I think even this table here can at least trigger some discussion in the field. And we also, now, I'll do the reflections first, and then I'll show you a few things. We found that digitalization and digitization differ distinctly from the two others. We found that digitalization and digital transformation are often conflated and confused. And we finally, in our sample, also found a few studies on digital transformation in government or public organization. I am not sure why. Why are we not using the same terminology as information systems? Perhaps somebody in the audience here can respond to that eventually. Anyway, we decided to see if we could nest these concepts because they are not, a way of looking at this is that they are sort of building on each other. So if we look at digitizing and digitizing and digitization, that is much to do with going from analog to digital. So quite basic, quite simple. Not necessarily easy, but anyway, relatively basic. A way of looking at digitalization then, since we would like to distinguish between digital transformation and digitization, would be to say that digitalization can be seen to have a main emphasis on process innovation. And then also not only from a technical side, but looking at it from both the social and the technical side together. And then finally, if we were to distinguish between digitalization and digital transformation, we could say that digital transformation is more oriented towards strategy, business models, organizational change, and also societal change. That's perhaps, I mean, if skeptics here would argue that IS has looked at organizational change and transformation of business model for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. Still, what we see now is that the new technology and the rapid implementation of new technology has consequences on the societal level in a way that we perhaps have not seen before. So that's, if we were to go with the literature, that's what we could be very sure about distinguishing. If we were to be a little bit more bold, like we are here, we put forward the proposition that this is one way of distinguishing between these three concepts. And then we have made some possible definitions to clarify this. And this is something that we will put forward in the book chapter. And I'm sure there will be a lot of comments from the community on this. So a question for discussion then is, how can these concepts from the IS field be utilized in the governance research? This is what we are working on now. We think it's relatively easy to come up with good examples of these three areas, these three concepts in the digital government domain. And that could be a way of bridging information systems research and e-governance research, which in my opinion might make a lot of sense. Anyway, that's what I had for now. I hope that was well within time. And if we have time for some comments or questions, that's excellent.
Yes, as I see, there are not so many questions per se. As I see, yes. Maybe the workshop was too exhaustive for someone, for some people.
Yeah, and of course, this is something that's easy for me to discuss since I have been looking into this. I mean, I have been guilty of not distinguishing between these concepts, of being very precise. Yeah,
Maria and Ronnie. Oh,
excellent.
Well, maybe we needed also to reflect a bit the questions. Well, first of all, thank you very much for a nice systematization of these different terms I think, and there was also the comment from Colin van Noort about government and governance. So we also need to distinguish this kind of concepts. But on the digitization and digitalization and digital transformation, aren't we back to, I think, at some point we had the discussion of this kind of holistic approaches in the design of digital government systems. I didn't find this term in your presentation. What do
I'm
you
sorry, which term?
Holistic design, holistic perspective, holistic.
No, good question. I think that's because of the search phrases we used. We looked for existing reviews on digital transformation in the IS literature mainly, but we searched broadly. So if anybody else had written about that, we should have identified that as well, I think. But,
okay,
but
so
in that
yeah, probably then the point is probably the recent publications don't use so much holistic as a term. Maybe this still needs to be integrated.
Yeah, good point.
Got the idea. Thank you.
I think Ronny had a question as well, or a comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Leif, for presenting the very interesting work that you're doing. I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion on the normative agenda behind this? Because if we assume that words are never neutral, there's always an agenda behind them, right? So if we think about the very term governance, then we think about, okay, the new public management ideology back in the 90s that brought this up. So I have two questions for you. Number one, what do you think is the agenda for this push towards digital transformation? In the IS world, you could argue it's a way to create a new concept area that would allow big professors to do more publications. From an institutional point of view, you could say it's a way for governments and the European Union to push forward a specific agenda and then use this new word. So what is the agenda behind this from what you could observe? And also, what is your own agenda as researcher? We say, before someone said, these concepts are all wrong. Some of them are more useful than others. So what is the usefulness for us as researchers to use this new vocabulary?
Yeah, excellent question. I think that's a very good point you are making there, Ronny. My understanding of digital transformation and why we are using that concept today is that much development today is being pushed by industry. So industry is a major player in the development. And also, since we are perhaps especially looking at the information systems literature, I think that literature or that scientific field can be accused of the same as I am sort of accusing the governance field of, to be techno-optimists. We are studying technology with the basic assumption that technology can help us solve problems. And we tend to forget that sometimes it also creates problems. So if we had done a similar study on the impact on digital technologies on society or on government from a political administration perspective, or from a social science perspective, or from a humanistic perspective, I think we might have seen some quite different tones in the science. So I think you are spot on, Ronny. I think part of the reason we are calling this digital transformation and that we are viewing this and understanding this as something positive is because it's techno-optimists that have coined that phrase and that are central actors in the discussion. And in my opinion, that's a good argument and a very strong argument for involving more people in the discussions.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, did you have two? I think you said you had two questions.
The second one was, I guess you covered it in the last part. What is the usefulness for us researchers of this type of exercise that you're doing?
Yeah, that's for you to decide, I guess. But for me, it's sort of clarifying. It's a sensitizing exercise, actually, because as I said before, I have not always been very sensitive myself if I use the term government or governance in my research. But when you are discussing issues with colleagues at public administration or political science, they will say, what do you mean by government? What do you mean by governance? And that challenges me to reflect on what I mean, and it challenges me to be more precise. And since I have been challenged now, I looked into the e-governance literature and I looked at, okay, so how precise is this field? Have others been doing the same thing as I have? And my understanding is that, yes, we have not always been very precise. And I think that's problematic because we are discussing apples and bananas sometimes. Yeah. And I think we as a scientific field would benefit from being more precise once in what we do.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that, if I may add, applies also to this government versus governance concepts, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's also an argument for perhaps, I don't know if you agree with my relatively superficial assessment that we are a quite empirically driven field, and that's all well and good. But if we are going to advance it as a scientific field, I also think that we need to make space for some more conceptual development and some more theoretical development, because when we are discussing the latest hype all the time, that will be our research stand a good chance of being out to date in 10 years. Whereas if we make a good theory, it can last much longer.
Yeah, fully agree. What maybe I can add on this, also related to the previous discussion with Yannis on the different neighboring domains. I think getting an understanding from the different neighboring domains and bring that together is still the challenge that we have to face, and where we have to find a common approach. Interdisciplinary research is not a common thing yet, also because our career systems are rather focused on monodisciplinary process. And if we want to change this way of how we address societal challenges in research, I think we also need to make an attempt to change this kind of academic system career process more interdisciplinary, which I don't see so much yet going on.
Oh, I think that's an excellent point. I think I believe that we are sort of an interdisciplinary field, e-government, e-governance. And we have scholars, we are mixing at least computer science, information systems. We have some public administration scholars among us.
I agree. So, I agree on that. And I've realized that when we bring in somebody from a different discipline that is new to this area, it takes quite some time that they get acquainted to this interdisciplinary thinking that we have. And I love that from our discipline that we have a step.
But I think we have made, I agree. I think we have made some progress, though. I think we have some quite good journals. I think GIQ is a very good journal. It's not at the extreme top end of journals, but it's very good. And we have other journals as well that will accept interdisciplinary work in our field. So I think we should continue to build on that and support GIQ and other journals that open up for interdisciplinary research.